Hi.
All right, let's wait a couple more minutes. Can't believe half the year is gone, but we've been having a good time.
I think Rachel's connection stopped, right?
Hey, Rachel, we can't hear you.
She's frozen. I can quickly type her in, write her in Slack.
Connie, do you have the agenda sync? Do you want to back up Rachel?
Sure, Kavya. Hello. Hey, everyone. Thank you for joining this month's Medical XR Advisory Council meeting organized by Medical XRSI. Today, we have two speakers who will be sharing their view and their knowledge and experience on the medical XRSI field. First, we have Janet Johnson. She is an human computer interface researcher and PhD candidate at UC San Diego. And then we have a council member, Dr. Charles Naduka, who will be sharing his experience. He is the CEO and chief scientist at MTech Labs. He's also a council member with Medical XRSI. So I would first like Janet to start with the session, if that's okay with Janet.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Great.
Yeah, hi everyone.
Sorry to interrupt, Janet. Do you have anything to share?
Yeah, I made a little presentation just to sort of talk about like high level insights from the use cases thing.
Sure.
And also to give people a background of like who I am for those who haven't met me yet.
Sure. So I will stop presenting and you can then start your presentation if you want.
All right. Give me just a sec. Ooh. Right, hang on. Sorry, the Zoom controls are sort of in the way. Okay. Well, hi everyone. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay, I don't see the little green Zoom thing, but okay. So I'm Janet Johnson. I'm a PhD candidate at UC San Diego, and specifically I'm part of two labs. One is the design lab, and we focus on sort of human-centered thinking and human-centered design, not just for technology, but across the board for technology and communities. And we've been working a lot with like the San Diego and Tijuana sort of border regions as well. And then the second lab I'm part of is the human-centered extended intelligence lab that specifically focuses on AI and XR in healthcare primarily, but also more work. I just want to give you a very quick overview of what I do so you have context, and I'd obviously appreciate if anyone wanted to talk to me about any of the projects I talk about, but it's a very quick overview. So in the, in the past I primarily started doing research within the healthcare space. It wasn't necessarily XR when I started. And so some of the projects that I did do was I sort of looked at family member understanding in the ICU, where I spent over 6 months doing shifts with the, doing shifts in the ICU, just sort of observing things. I also had this project from PCORI that was funded by PCORI, but it was for supporting patient-physician communication. I've designed voice interfaces for older adults that I'm no longer on that project, but it has sort of moved through and is going through sort of like different experiments right now. And I've also been involved with Recode Health or CORE at UCSD, which fundamentally looks at having guidelines and frameworks for ethics, research ethics specifically under digital health. And in the XR space, I just want to quickly go through some of the main projects I've done. this was with PwC. We sort of built a data analysis tool for population health risks. It was sort of a collaborative tool for that. I've created experiments and evaluated mixed reality for different emergencies. The main one was CPR, but it was more a domain. And again, these were HCI or human computer interaction evaluations of how well or how suited this technology is to be able to provide sort of guidance or any sort of like support during an emergency. Some of my biggest project during the PhD has actually been to use XR for remote guidance for surgery. It was a project I did with the Navy and a couple of different labs at UCSD, where we had an expert surgeon in virtual reality and a novice surgeon in augmented reality. And again, the goal was guidance during emergencies, specifically trauma scenarios. But in this case, you had an expert guiding you. So a lot of my work was around sort of understanding the communication and the collaboration aspects and how do we make sure everyone has the information they need and it's accurate where it needs to be. And so my dissertation across all of these different projects has sort of come down to more foundational HCI research. HCI is human-computer interaction, but it really is looking at both the cognitive and the technology aspects of how that interaction between people using the system and even stakeholders outside of that system work. And so more specifically, my dissertation looks at how we can exploit the spatial nature of extended reality to make it easier to communicate and collaborate. So I kind of take a deep dive on the cognitive aspect, on the cognitive side on communication and how communication works, and then look at how XR can help make that more efficient. Also, I'm really sorry. There are 3 weeks in San Diego where my allergies are through the roof. This is one of them, unfortunately. So if I'm sniffling, I don't have COVID, it's just allergies. And so outside of academia, I've worked with what is now Meta Reality Labs, PwC, Microsoft, and Juniper. I started out as a software engineer, sort of moved to UX design, and then moved over to UX research. And most of my UX research experience has been sort of in the extended reality space. I also, surprisingly, this is one thing that does inspire me and keeps me going with research as well. And weirdly enough, I learn a lot about this research here as well. But I also volunteer at the California Wolf Center. So I work with, at a wolf conservatory. I usually just sort of help out both on their research side, but also just sort of doing the nitty-gritty work of feeding the wolves and keeping them safe. But today, mainly, I wanted to talk about the use cases and guidelines research project that we started. And Rachel and Elena were both like heavily involved with this. And Elena, I think, wrote the white paper on this as well. And so I just wanted to give you an update on the research side. And there's more to the project than what you will see today, but we can obviously talk about that once we're done. So in terms of what we set out to do about, I would say like almost a year ago, we wanted to look at how we create guidelines for XR, for healthcare and XR applications in it. And so there are 3 different questions that we tackled. The first one was how practitioners today think about privacy, safety, security, and ethics risks for XR in healthcare. The second question was if there were any unique considerations or challenges regarding XR safety that practitioners specifically in healthcare needed to be aware of. And the third question was, can we provide a framework to help people sort of simplify their process of understanding these different types of risks, and what is the best way to operationalize these guidelines? And anyone who's in the healthcare space, or all of you know that the social aspect of when you have an intervention that gets put in, the adoption primarily depends on like, how do we make it easy to use? Does it fit within the current processes? And what are the challenges there? And so we did 2 things. The first one was an online survey. We had 22 participants just sort of talk about their general perceptions about XR and risks within XR. And then we also had 15 semi-structured interviews with people who were sort of building XR applications in healthcare. So this was CEOs of certain startups, research practitioners and clinical sort of stakeholders or partners as well. So we covered a range of different sort of type of people who are in the space designing and building these applications. And what we talked about a couple of different things, and one was their individual use case. So we sort of did a deep dive into understanding what they're building, why they're building it, and this like specific risks within those applications. And then we also had a discussion about the different classes of risks. And so a lot of this was sort of the grounding or the foundational aspect was from XRSI's privacy and security framework. But we talked about these 4 classes of risks. One was data, physical health, physical safety, mental health, and sort of other miscellaneous ones that didn't come up, and more specifically, more like intangible ethical risks. We talked about how people went about assessing these risks, informing people, relevant people about these risks, having a sense of how they manage these risks, and any sort of interventions they've taken to prevent them. And the goal was just to understand how are people thinking about these risks, are they thinking about these risks, and how, if they have any like processes, and to see if we could find any themes within those processes. We also talked about what an ideal sort of form of guidelines or tool would be. So we asked people if they had sort of this supporting structure, what they would like that to be, and what it should look like, and what it should have. Now, just because like this is again qualitative data, they're surveys and interviews. So just to keep in mind as I go forward is, it is obviously biased by that population. It's a very small population, but we only have a small population working on these things right now. But also that it's qualitative data, which means that I haven't pulled anything, that this is not my opinion, this is coming from the data, and it is not a personal sort of like, it doesn't reflect their personal values. It's again, sort of bubbling up what we've heard over time. In terms of analyzing it, the general structure, just for those who aren't aware of qualitative data, is you take the transcripts or any data you have, you kind of break it up into these little snippets. For us, it was essentially a single thing that someone said, or different phrases about a certain thing. And then you code them or you tag them on what that phrase is telling you. And so in our data, we've had over 400 codes, just because we covered such a wide variety of use cases and perceptions across the board. And like even the type of people we were talking to, we've talked to CEOs, researchers, developers, healthcare practitioners. So you obviously get this mix. The codes were primarily, these are just example codes, just to give you a sense of what it would look like. But we had these different codes and that we tagged the data with, and that we then pulled out insights from. And I won't go into the details about these insights, but we do have a document that goes into a little more detail. We're still in the sort of process of sort of finessing that. So I would again say, like, don't share this out anywhere. Usually I add participant codes so you have a better sense, but today I just wanted to give you a sense of sort of like the high level insights that we saw. The first is that, as you would imagine, there isn't a structured approach to thinking about risk, especially with XR. For those that did have some form of an approach, none of it was standard, but it was primarily based on discussions they've had with stakeholders and their collective background. So knowledge that they already had, efforts they were putting into to try and understand a certain sort of aspect or a certain type of risk. And specifically for healthcare applications, practitioners relied quite heavily on existing regulations. So either regulations in the EU or the HIPAA regulations here, to understand what to assess and how to communicate these risks. Most people we talked to were confident that if they covered their bases with their regulations, that it covered all of the privacy and security issues they needed to be concerned about. Again, it's debatable whether that's true or not, but this is generally how people perceived how well they were sort of like tackling these different risks. The knowledge of, like any knowledge of mental health or physical safety risks came from previous experience. So again, there are very few resources to look into here, especially in terms of research. and also in terms of any like sort of collective guidelines or a resource that they could go look for. So it came from either their previous experience with the technology or with the domain itself. So some domains had risks inherent to that, but it came from their experience. And most people, not most people, some people thought it was not a big concern yet, because people today use XR for a very short period of time. So all of the applications we talked to, they didn't require their users to be in XR or in VR or AR for very long. And so there was a general feeling of like that's not a huge concern just about yet. Everyone is still developing their policies, if at all. So the people we've talked to did not have, again, a very structured approach or a structured set of like a list of things that they do for different projects they go through. Some of the more mid-sized companies we've talked to are still developing their policies on XR, again, because it's a very fluid field. And almost everyone had very differing views of where responsibilities lie. So for the different types of risks, whether they were within, whether the responsibilities were theirs or the device manufacturer or the user or the clinician, etc. But the people did have differing views of that. And in terms of like just being able to create these policies as well, most did not have the expertise required to understand or prevent the risks that they were aware of. And in a lot of cases, people were aware that there was a class of risks under a, so if we talked about like mental health risk, they were aware that that could be a possibility, but they didn't have enough information to sort of go deeper into it and sort of like isolate different aspects. And especially because a lot of these projects were either research or early stage projects, this was not a priority in people's mind yet. Again, just as a reminder, this is not anyone's fault. This is just generally how it works. But it was sort of nice to see them talk about it that way as well. When it came to sort of the less spoken about or things that people were less aware of, and especially the less tangible risks like ethical risks of equity and the spectrum of like just risks that people aren't as aware of, that's generally poorly understood and not thought about entirely. In a lot of cases, people weren't really able to even sort of think about these types of risks as well. For example, data and privacy risks, there's a lot of awareness about that, but something like equity, that's not something that even crosses someone's mind. So data risks, because there is more awareness, they're generally prioritized. Ethics in general can be messy and confusing, and you really have to dive deep into your particular application and context. And so that was one of the other reasons why they didn't think through this, or it was sort of like put to the sidelines. And then some people felt that since these risks haven't come up yet in society in a big way, it would sort of be a hypothetical exercise and not worth their time. In terms of needs, again, just as a reminder, whatever I've talked about now is extremely high level. We have more detail, and obviously there's more subtlety to all of this, but we can talk about like how to use that. In terms of the needs, most people thought that like there was a need for resources and standardized tools, and they would use it to guide internal processes, educate stakeholders, and sort of just have this framework to operate within. We discussed a couple of different formats of sort of like resources that people would like. Outside of like a PDF with a lot of information was checklists. People were inclined towards self-assessment quizzes or a toolkit. People did mention AI, but I think the sentiment was more a dynamic toolkit. But everyone agreed that to be used, they needed to be specific, and like being vague would just make it unusable because everything is very dependent on context. They needed to be easily accessible and dynamic. So again, something more than a static resource or a checklist, and demonstrate both the limits and sort of the bare minimum requirements for certain different types of technologies. People also wanted examples either in the form of case studies or in the form of like example sort of risks. And then something else that came up was it had to coincide with what the market is driving towards. So if popular applications were using it, and even if it couldn't be specific across the board, you would actually, they still wanted it to sort of be a little more specific for what is currently popular in the market. some few other things that came up was any guideline at this point would be met with a level of skepticism, especially because it's a developing field and research is also still sort of keeping up. And so any like very harsh guidelines would be met with skepticism. It would be difficult to have a tool that sort of encompasses everything, especially the less tangible ethical concerns. And a few people thought that it would actually be helpful if checklists or toolkits or anything, any sort of resources came with a human aspect. So being able to like talk to an external consultant or being able to talk to XRSI, for example, and that could increase specificity. So you could essentially have these consultants come in and talk to you about your specific use case. There's a pretty strong sentiment about it not being a chatbot. Any sort of resource or tool that would be created would need to be created alongside experts in different medical fields. Again, this is to increase trust in it and also make sure we're covering our grounds, because the different fields in healthcare obviously vary quite drastically. And also it needed to go beyond just the US markets. We didn't talk about XRSI very specifically. I used it more as a probe or a way to like sort of create conversation. But the few things that we did get was that the existing framework was useful. So people were excited that this was work that was being done, and they thought there was potential for more and encouraged us to keep going. And a few people also thought that XRSI guidelines should be incorporated into sort of your IRBs or your independent review boards, and that increases the range of people it can help. Yeah, that's all I had for today. Again, super high level, but I'd like to discuss a few things, but primarily what, according to you, should be Medical XR's goals over the next like 2 to 5 years. And the reason I'm asking you this is because like the approach I take to thinking about these complex problems, especially when there's a social aspect, is something called human-centered or humanity-centered approach. And so we can ensure we're solving the right problem, one that we are uniquely positioned for, and continue using sort of this human-centered process to understand latent needs and also collectively create the artifacts that people need. In terms of what's next, we still have to publish our white paper on just the different use cases and risks we covered. And hopefully this project is a start for, we can talk about it, but maybe a bigger research project that really looks at how to create guidelines in a field that's in flux, and publish it at high impact venues, again, supporting any artifacts that come out, and that hopefully will increase trust or adoption. That's all I had.
Thank you, Janet. And does anybody have any questions for Janet or any ideas for what the logical continuation of this use cases project should be?
I have one question, mainly just to Jen's experience. Can you comment what, like from all these learnings, from comments from those interviews, what things like were maybe surprising for you, or something that you maybe did not expect and found out in these interviews in terms of this attitude towards frameworks and guidelines and risks?
Yeah, I think, I mean, it comes out in the data less, but the part that was surprising was, I think, so we split up our conversation. Our first few interviews, we sort of talked about risks in general, but then eventually we realized it was really hard for people to talk about these things, especially when, you know, they don't consider themselves an expert in the area. So we split it up into different types of risks and like added more probes to help them sort of like help us have a conversation about it. And one of the main things that I think came up, or I mean, didn't come up, but like that I felt, was that it was really easy for people to talk about data and privacy risks, and even to some extent physical safety risks, just because they're more tangible. And I wouldn't say privacy is very tangible, but it is a well-known topic. You don't have to be a privacy expert to know it's important. And so people were a lot more willing to talk about it. But I think when it came to mental health and ethical risks beyond, it was those sessions went by so fast, because there just wasn't a lot without a lot of prompting. And I don't know if it was surprising, like the fact that there isn't a process, but just how reliant they are on the people working, like on the knowledge of the people working on it, which is inherently like biased, even if people try to the best of their abilities, and everyone can't be an expert in everything. So I think just that, I think like just how driven that was based on what is considered a popular risk today was a little surprising.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions?
No, I like the CPR idea. I think that the current modules that are for CPR that are trying to be interactive are not, state of the art, even though American Heart Association uses them. So this might be really a nice step up from what's currently out in the marketplace, and that's paid for. I mean, we pay for these classes, etc. So I thought that was an interesting concept that might be able to improve the end user experience and the level of engagement. Yeah. So that was very nice. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, the CPR training, I think, is being picked up a lot more, like especially within VR as much. Like we were focusing more on using AR just to like provide guidance. Again, we use CPR as an example, but any sort of like emergency guidance, just being able to understand like how do you provide these different cues to help people think about what to do in that space, especially if it's an emergency or not. You don't have a lot of time to learn a new skill.
And emergency preparedness also does the active shooter.
Yeah.
Right. So yeah, that would actually be kind of all under the emergency preparedness.
Yeah.
Live interactive. It actually might be very interesting. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Janet, for this presentation, and we're looking forward to having you lead the next phase. This was phase one. This project was phase one of the privacy and safety framework, the medical portion of it, and Janet will be leading the next phase as we define the next phase, and we'll welcome Janet formally to the council. She's been with us, working with us for the last couple of years, so this is not a surprise. Thank you, Jen. Yes. Very happy to have you here. And thank you, Banujit, for picking up for my network issues. All right.
Just one quick thing regarding the framework development. The only thing that I want to add is we are waiting till the Patient Advisory Council by FDA until July 12th. So this now allows us at least a month, and we as a council members can take the time this month. We can share with you what we have so far, at least with respect to the white paper, and then seek out some input directly. Like you can asynchronously comment on that paper, and you have like a month. And even after that, so we're like literally waiting to hear from FDA, because their agenda is like the risks related to AR, VR. For the first time, that would be a focused conversation, but focused on patient safety, etc. So that's going to really help us sort of gauge like what's coming, what are they up to, because there's a lot of progress MDIC, other group, is making that's connected to FDA. So just wanted to put that timeline out there, that we have plenty of time to put the feedback into this document, which will circulate with the medical council notes.
Sounds great. All right, next on the agenda, Charles. Charles needs no introduction. He's been with us for the last couple of years, and we all look forward to hearing what MTech is up to. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to try to share the screen. Give me 1 second. I'm on a different computer today, so hope it works okay. Is that my computer doing that noise, by the way? Yeah. Are you hearing that notification? No.
Yeah, no, but Charles, I always struggle. I'm like, should I say Dr. Naruka or Charles? But I'm going to say Charles.
It's Charles.
It was great to see you on Reuters and all over media trying to tell the world what happened to Justin Bieber. I was like, whoa, here is like, I don't know if anybody saw that, but like Dr. Naduk has been like all over social media everywhere worldwide because of the whatever the palsy syndrome that was.
Yeah, it's interesting. It was, you know, so just the background. So I'm a plastic surgeon. I help patients with facial paralysis. I also founded a charity literally 10 years ago, Facial Palsy UK, which helps to provide information and support to patients and also to health professionals to make sure they get diagnosed and properly treated. And actually, 2018, we did a big campaign about Ramsay-Hunt syndrome, and it got very little traction. And I have to thank Justin Bieber because, you know, for sharing his story, because actually now, you know, most patients who have the condition get misdiagnosed, don't get the treatment on time, and therefore end up with this terrible condition, which has more than just the facial palsy, but also causes dizziness, hearing loss, balance problems, chronic pain. It's a horrible condition, but yeah, in sharing his story, it did at least allow us to make that point clear. So I'm going to talk a bit about the work I do with MTech. So I'll give a bit of background. You may be wondering why the hell is a plastic surgeon getting involved in technology, but there is a method to it. So I'm talking about behavioral health and how it relates to XRSI in terms of privacy and safety, and I'm really open to questions. So I'm a doctor primarily before I'm a surgeon, and obviously the whole idea is to avoid harm for patients. Many people don't realize that 7 out of 10 of the top leading causes of premature death are behavioral in their origins. If you go back down to the root cause, be it heart disease, cancers, many cancers due to obesity, chronic lung disease, smoking, accidents through alcohol, drugs, emotional instability, stroke, again, hypertension, stress. All these conditions can really be pinpointed back down to behavioral aspects, even Alzheimer's, to be honest, because there's a big factor around sleep and Alzheimer's, and that's obviously behavioral around people being stressed. But whilst the world is moving towards ever smaller, ever miniaturized sensors to understand behavior, therefore to give people actual insights, we don't really have much in the way of understanding emotions. We don't really have something that can help us to understand how people feel, to give them actionable insight. And I think about this like a car with a dashboard. You know, you have a dashboard there to provide you with an early warning sign that your battery's low, or your oil's low, or you're running out of fuel, because by doing so, you can avoid that negative consequence. And most of the money spent on healthcare right now is kind of spent on the accident repair shop when the car's crashed, trying to fix it up. Whereas what we should have is more information much earlier for preemptive, preventative care. Of course, XR has got a lot of applications across many, many areas, but obviously health is a huge one. It's always very disappointing to me around, I went to see a good friend of mine who was the British doctor who's now in the States, and you know, this is a $4 trillion industry, which is not really geared towards prevention because there's too many vested interests around earning money through excessive use of investigations and multiple consultations and that sort of thing. And this is terrible. You know, we should not be tolerating a system that has got incentives so misaligned with what the patient actually needs, which is to stay well rather than to be fixed from being sick. And so my work as a surgeon specialized in facial paralysis, but also my work as a plastic surgeon more generally, which has basically funded much of the development we've done so far, is about people wanting to fit into the model of themselves, the model of how they want to be, how they see themselves, and how they want themselves to be in the future. They want to be, in inverted commas, normal. This chap had he has facial paralysis due to tumor in his case, and we can do surgery to help these patients, but actually there are many, many more patients who can't be helped because their problem is not due to the nerve being cut, but due to a misorganization or disorganization of the nerve connections to the muscles. And so it was in doing so that I was looking at what we were doing in clinic. The picture on top right shows a system we used in the clinic called facial EMG, and that helps patients to relearn their muscle activations. We got some funding from the National Institute for Health Research back in 2016 to do an initial pilot study to look at developing actually a miniaturized home-based system that patients could use to understand facial expressions, to avoid overcorrect and overcompensating certain things. We even developed a prototype system for VR-based therapy, but actually we realized it's going to be too expensive for individual patients if you're trying to deal with that relatively small population. And hence the need for us to broaden the applicability of the core technology to wider use cases, therefore produce more devices, reduce the cost per unit, and therefore circle back and make it more accessible to patients with those specific issues. So this is the prototype system. So patients would basically be guided through a series of exercises. First of all, to learn how to baseline their face to reduce the activity, and then have certain exercises to help them to do initially very small movements, do bigger movements, because otherwise you can end up with abnormal patterns of movements. So here you have this screen where it shows the muscle activations on the individual muscles, and the therapist is kind of telling the user what to do and how to reduce activation in more than one area at a time. So that was the use case around facial palsy, but as I say, it's too small a use case. But also we know from our background, when I did psychological disorders in my pre-clin sort of intermediate degree, EMG has been used in neuroscience and psychology for many years as an objective marker of valence, that's to say, degree of positivity or negativity. And so by applying it across a number of use cases, including research, allows us to broaden the applicability and hopefully help more people, and also, importantly, to help with research. So I've got a team. We're now headcount 30, which is terrifying every month. Data scientists, hardware engineers, software engineers, and my first investor actually was my original thesis supervisor, Aradazi, who's himself a technologist and also ex-health minister. We've worked with a number of universities now, mostly on research projects around using technology to help them to measure objectively either how people respond to things or objects, or how different people respond to the same stimulus. And I'll give you a couple of examples of that. So we did quite a big study at London Science Museum where we had 800 people going through an experience designed in collaboration with the psychology department at Bournemouth University, which was designed to be either neutral, positive, or negative. And basically, we had each person conduct to partake in psychological surveys and questionnaires to see how different people respond to stimuli that were, let's say, positively neutral or negatively valenced experiences. What was really interesting about that was the actual experience was about 40 minutes long. And we're asking people some quite long questions in addition to that VR experience, those 3 VR experiences. And people were incredibly open and willing to participate. And I think partly due to our research fellow, Maverick, she's amazing, and she kind of framed it as what we're doing here. We're in a new frontier of XR. We want to try to understand what constitutes normal, because unless you know what constitutes normal, it's very hard to work out. First of all, who's in the category of, for example, has got anxiety issues or depression, or whichever condition you're looking at. You need to understand what constitutes the baseline, and then from that you can now look at the range of severities. And so that piece of work around understanding a wider population was very important as a sort of starting point. We are doing work with one of the large healthcare providers in the Netherlands, a project called PTSD, which is funded by the EU, a big project to develop online EMDR, which is eye movement desensitization reprocessing. It's a therapy which is it's been around for a couple of decades now, and people don't really understand how it works, but it is very effective. Patients with PTSD, essentially they're with a therapist and they are instructed to move their eyes in a very rhythmic fashion whilst recalling these traumatic experiences. And what it does is it seems to somehow decouple your present from your past experience, and it's very effective. Now, the problem with it at the moment is that it has to be delivered face-to-face. And the idea was to see whether this could be done via VR. One of the benefits of VR is that you can incorporate sensors like eye tracking, which allows you to deliver the therapy both remotely, but also very precisely understand whether your patient is engaging adequately in the experience. And so we're doing work on using eye tracking plus measuring physiological parameters, arousal, heart rate variability, and facial muscle activation to help to tailor the treatment and to ensure that patients aren't being overstimulated during the presentation of the experiences. So if the patient isn't engaging, obviously they're not following the visual cue in time, and that's very important. But also you can use the pupil diameter as a measure of the arousal in addition to heart rate measures. We're also working with content creators as well, and this is really important for XR. You know, one of the things that really most terrifies me about this whole new area is that we saw what happened with smartphone apps. You know, as soon as the iPhone came out, no sooner than that, there were numerous hundreds, thousands, now probably millions of apps out there around healthcare. None of them went through any sorts of proper validation. They were launched into the public unaware. There's no framework in place to ensure that they were both effective and safe. And obviously XR, given the fact that it is so immersive, it can cause problems. Those of you who've read Brendan Spiegel's book about VR, he talks in actually the first few pages about how he thinks he made a given patient terrible anxiety. I think he called it PTSD, but I think he was kind of exaggerating there. But you know, it can create a lot of emotional arousal, and so you need to, just as you would in healthcare, to dose your intervention. There's no dosing at the moment in XR, and so one thing we hope our technology can do is help to understand what is a normal dose or the correct dose for an individual. So this study was initially done on a commercial basis to help people navigate a design for a new station. Now, it's basically to try and assess frustration or confusion. But the same principles that underpin that can underpin doing things such as training. So we're doing a project now with Brighton University around basic life support training. This is VR-based training, which obviously we've just been talking about as being potentially very, very good. But there's a really important core assumption at the base of this is that VR training is as good as real life training, you know, with the mannequin and instruction in place. But unless one is able to test that, I think it's potentially dangerous to roll things out into the real world unless you have validated that the training, first of all, is going to elicit similar sort of responses as you'd see in real life, and also that you can track the improvements over time as well. And so it applies to all kinds of training, first responder training. You know, it's all very well having a VR training for, say, fire evacuation, but if it's so unrealistic that the person doesn't feel at all stressed or agitated, well, it could well be that you can sign a person off, but then when they're faced with a real life situation, they could fall apart. So XR has the ability to allow us to make things ever more immersive, ever more realistic, which should allow us to make sure that the training is actually valid. We're working at the moment with the International Red Cross. They are using, who knew they had a VR team? They do have a VR team, quite a big team actually in Geneva, and they've made this fantastic experience around the conflict zone, and they want to see whether the experience of it in VR versus watching on a 2D screen has different effects in terms of people's willingness to make donations for the Red Cross. And so we're working with the University of Geneva on this. Again, to do this, you want to look objectively at how people are responding to what they're experiencing, what they're seeing. And that's quite a big study, which is, I'd say, still ongoing just now. And so for us, you know, we're working with researchers, we're changing research from being something that is very expensive, involves traveling, to basically making research in a box so that you can have everything all in one place and much more scalable. It's quite useful in the pandemic when people couldn't travel, being able to basically send a device to people and do remote research. Obviously, content creators also wanted to do this because they want to make sure before they go to the expense of getting things approved and launched, does it actually work or not? And as I say, I think this is going to be a critical stage in development of XR. You know, this is kind of dose control. You would never dream of launching a new treatment on the market without understanding whether it's suitable for, you know, the drug treatment, whether it's suitable for somebody who is, you know, 40 kilograms versus 140 kilograms. You have to be able to titrate the treatment to the individual, which is the whole essence of personalization. And obviously, the future is hopefully going to be away from clinic-based centralized approach to more home-based approaches where people can have personalized treatment that is more objective, gamified to encourage ongoing engagement, but also able to give documented evidence of efficacy so that it gets funded, because without funding, the whole area will collapse. overlaps. So as I mentioned, we're doing a few projects at the moment, PTSD, facial paralysis. We're also doing a recent project that's starting shortly with Oxford University on social anxiety, which is going to be really interesting as well. Again, social anxiety, very, very difficult to treat, very difficult to assess. Obviously, with the amazing benefits of VR and also the improvements in the creation of avatars, we have an opportunity to do something that could otherwise be very, very difficult to start up with, one-to-one interaction with an avatar and then have increasing numbers of people, increasing proximity, different ethnicities, races, genders, different contexts. And I'm super excited about the potential for this for patients with this condition and those with autism as well. I mean, talking points really around this, obviously collaboration is key, and the amazing work that you're doing, Rachel and Kavya, well, all of you really, in pushing forward this field, so important. Obviously, privacy, security, safety is key as well. At the same time, it has to be balanced. And one of the things I worry about a lot, and I've been speaking to Rachel and Kavya about this, is that if things are too closed off too early, of course, we have to have privacy by default, much in the same way that a patient sees me as a doctor. They expect, of course, that everything they tell me will be kept private and secure. But at the same time, they recognize that them being able to have treatment is dependent on the generosity of people who came before them, who allowed their data to be used to understand treatments, to allow aggregation of data to understand what constitutes normal, what constitutes disease states, and how you measure the severity of disease. So it's really super important, I think, in XR, we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater and close things down so much that we don't allow research, because otherwise there'll be no progress. A good analogy is the Human Genome Project, where we would never have these amazing developments in gene therapies and vaccines and all sorts of things unless people had willingly gave what essentially is the most personal information about them, which is their genetic code. And I hope that we can think about a model that is both secure, private, but also able to allow collaboration. Thank you for your time. Sorry, I went a bit over. And questions, please.
So first of all, Dr. Maduka, Charles, thank you so much for this presentation. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, you know, sorry.
Okay. Yeah, I was really keen to learn more about specifically the device, as well as the kind of biomarker that, the lab in the box. And reason I'm really keen to learn more about this because, as you may be aware, we're engaged in a NIST-funded grant work for performing augmented reality, for basically discovering natural authentication methods for augmented reality use cases, and specifically for public safety officers, which includes EMTs, police officers, etc. We are kind of looking at, EKG, EMG, ECG, etc. But of course, we need to capture that. But other is like analyze it. Can you actually authenticate a real, like a human being with that particular biomarker, particular sensors needs to be there. So just, gathering your insight on that from an authentication perspective. One, with respect to the hardware. The second aspect is with respect to these type of biomarkers and sensors. So what's your sort of overall, and maybe you haven't looked at it from an authentication perspective, but maybe you've seen some of the data, the indicators that, these are unique biomarkers that we are seeing that could potentially be used for this use case. Any insights there would be really, useful.
Yeah, so it's a really interesting point, actually. One of the things that the work we were doing with facial palsy led us to discover that even healthy volunteers, so what we were looking at initially was just collecting data from healthy people to understand what is the range of normality, that's normality amongst people without facial paralysis, so that we can work out how sensitive we need to be for patients with facial paralysis. And one thing we discovered was that there are inherent asymmetries in people which are unique, and it's those asymmetries that are really interesting because they are spontaneous, they are not under voluntary control, that's really, really important when you're thinking about a biometric authentication system, because if it's easy to spoof, that's a problem. So that's one of the things that's quite useful. There has been work before also on using heart measures as well. I don't know how, I remember there was a company trying to do this about 8 years ago or something, but they seem to have gone away. I suspect it was because it was too narrow a signal, using just that one-dimensional information of the heart rate or even the ECG was too difficult to find features that are unique enough to the individual. Whereas if you're using multimodal parameters, it's much more accurate. So it's not just relying on, in our case, not just on the EMG, which is obviously multi-channel anyway. You could use actually a multiple range of things, such as even just the pattern of movements. You'll have seen the work that was done from Stanford on just taking data from the IMU from a headset and using that to identify individuals. And that's mostly probably due to the height, because obviously they're using the Vive, which gives you very accurate measurements. And obviously it's very difficult to spoof your height. Certainly it's very hard to make yourself taller than you could be in, say, high-heeled shoes or whatever. People's gait parameters are also quite unique to them. We can see that we're doing some work on Parkinson's. There's not a piece of hardware that we have which is glasses-based, which is doing some work on Parkinson's. So gait is also something that's individual. And it's partly related to your height, again, because your leg length and stride length are going to be different. Also, age, posture whilst you're walking, and any previous illnesses that can cause some asymmetries in your gait pattern.
That's fantastic. And that is definitely one of the aspects to evaluate this is, once we establish that these are potential parameters and this is a potential sensor that we recommend for that particular use case, XRSI's specific role and one of the phases is to be able to hack it, spoof it. How secure is it? Because it is specifically for that, use case where we're looking at people potentially even targeting to replicate or spoof and stuff. So very insightful.
That sounds fascinating. And this is using AR, is that right? Or is it?
It is specifically AR. However, it's directed as AR, but it's the sensor and everything, the biomarkers. It really is XR. We are still utilizing any kind of headset where we could receive the data. One other question that I was wondering is, as you're using this to establish, let's say, a baseline, what is normal, etc., and then taking it to a collective analysis, what kind of a machine learning models or kind of a deep learning things that you're applying to this, and then any insights there that you may want to share that is viable or useful? Because when you talk about the height, like when I was working at the Linden Lab, this was something that we ran into, is we wanted to calculate height. It's really difficult. And then we basically wrote a few lines of code and applied machine learning, put a bunch of people in there, and voila, it now automatically comes up as, accurate height adjustment.
Yeah. It's really interesting. I mean, this is not my core area. Obviously, I actually rely on my fantastic data scientists around this. I can say that, so obviously, when we're looking at biometric parameters, you can think about things, obviously, those that are normally distributed in terms of things like height, for example, and then things that aren't, such as parameters around, say, skills, for example, which maybe will have a power law relationship as well. So you have to use different analysis methods for those things. One of the problems that have been in the past around psychology to understand, say, emotions from expressions, for example, is trying to apply a universal model to all people, and that's clearly wrong, and that's been thoroughly discredited now in the literature. Some great research that's been done by Lisa Felden-Barrett, who's been advising us. In fact, in that question around what methods, so population statistics is the method that one needs to use, which basically is recognizing the fact that yes, you can look at a whole group of people from a sort of 50,000 foot level and get some commonalities, but you really need to dig down to the individual. It's a bit like trying to work out language by just saying, okay, well, what's that sound mean? Unless you understand what language the person's speaking, you can get it very wrong. The word map could mean mother, it could mean a whole range of things according to the language you're speaking. So it's really a question of thinking about the context in which the signal is being measured.
I have like a gazillion other questions, but I'm going to reserve them. Maybe email it to you. Uh, um, I think maybe one last question I might ask. So as we are investigating this AR authentication and this sort of applying machine learning to learn this, we were under the impression that we create the model for maybe voice as a baseline, then we can incrementally improve upon it and apply other signals to it. Do you agree with that sort of approach? Is that, kind of viable?
Yeah, I think voice is a good one. The only problem with voice, obviously, is that it's explicit. So when I think about bodily signals, I think about what's explicit and what's implicit. So when I think about implicit, I think what implicit things are things that you can do, things that you have to do just to be alive. So your heart's got to beat for you to be alive. You've got to breathe to be alive. That's a good starting point. You've got to be in the world. Obviously, one really, really easy way to authenticate is that only one object can occupy the same space at the same time. So that's one thing you can use with AR, for example. You can obviously spatially say, okay, well, is that person in that location at this time? Because obviously, to say no two people can be in the same place at the same time. That's one way of doing it. Then explicit things are things like voice. But obviously with voice, you have issues around privacy because you have to be explicit there. You have issues around the fact that you're not talking all the time. And so you may want to have a system that is constantly authenticating, which is something that could be very, very useful. But yeah, I mean, my bank uses voice to get me into my account. Not so good when I was sick and I couldn't get in because my voice changed.
Yeah. Very cool. Thank you so much. And I know that the people that are working with me on this grant have, expressed interest. Maybe even we may want to open a dialogue, maybe a briefing with the NIST folks, because they are conducting research on even other areas. And I believe that your lab in the box, specifically that hardware and the setup and the research, could be very insightful for other use cases. They could, potentially guide the participants there.
There is another technology I've not spoken about, but these are our sensor-enabled glasses. They use a different technology called optomography, and so they don't require contact between the person and these are the prototype. That's why they're so clunky, but they're going to get smaller. But these are suitable for AR use, and so rather than measuring from contact on the skin, it's using optomography, which is a new technology that we developed, and which I think will probably be the future of that kind of interactivity, be able to either do expressive avatars remotely with XR, but also potentially for authentication. So we're doing some data collection with that just now to look at large groups of people and see how accurate it is, but that's only just started. We need to collect a lot of data for that.
Yeah, wonderful. And one other insight that I think is remarkable that you mentioned is like, we can't just like close collaboration. And that's what, when we look at the medical XR focused XRSI framework, it's not to just like reduce that you can't exchange data. You actually have to, and you must. In fact, Dr. Spiegel's department, one of them, I met the patient 0 for specific type of a BCI surgery connected to other heart issues, but they just didn't talk to Dr. Spiegel's department, even though she was in like 15 plus pain. And I was like, oh my God, you could use this VR, use case to mitigate your pain because you've just had all this wiring done on your body, and you could connect all this data to potentially VR, but was not allowed. And that's kind of it defeats the purpose to close those walls. And within the hospital systems, we want to like remove that stigma. It's like, no, you should exchange data within this ecosystem, but these are the parameters. And so very, very insightful there.
I mean, the reason why I mention that, because obviously in the EU, we've had this, they really want to close things down, and, you can't even navigate a website now without having to, read these guidelines and click a box, whatever. But it's just really important that that balance is there. And obviously, the reason for it, obviously, is companies like Meta, Facebook, whatever, have exploited data in the past, which has kind of sort of muddied the field. But clearly, we have a huge opportunity here to help a lot of people. So
exactly. Yeah. So Janet, I think when we continue to work on our framework, we always have to keep in mind for the medical use case, you could be saving lives and you could be reducing real pain. by just exchanging data, and it like differs from the quote unquote GDPR and privacy by design. That's why it has to be looked at differently, because you're literally missing out if you don't allow that. And so that has to be just like very narrowly curated, where you share, where you don't share. I mean, in the US, you don't share with the insurance providers. That could be, but like, you know, they're going to deny you coverage because XYZ disease is progressing. And so that kind of a mindset is what we're keeping. And so your, you know, your assessment there is truly insightful and very validating for what we're gearing for. We'll keep that in mind, Janet.
Yeah. Yeah, I think like one thing that maybe I didn't mention was like a lot of what came out was like, even if you just had a framework that told people how do they go about even like finding out these risks, like not that they have to do something about it, because that's very context dependent, but even just a framework of like, here's how you think about like a space that's so new that no one on the team has any expertise on. Just because again, it's a new field and a lot of teams don't come from people with expertise in Excel before. Like I have a formal education in Excel. That's not going to be the case for like 90% of the people creating sort of these applications.
Yeah.
Very cool. Over to you, Rachel.
All right. Thank you, everybody. This was very educational, and we will make the video available so that I can certainly rewatch and get more of the information into my brain. And other people will be able to watch as well. So thank you, and stay tuned for next month meeting with Dr. Shafi Ahmed. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Quick question.
Yeah.
When this gets shared, is it just to the council or does it get shared outside as well?
You're part of the council.
Oh no, I meant like just
Yeah.
because my presentation had like very high level insights, but if it's going out, I would preface that with multiple other things and have like there's a different way we I just because people signed our consent forms, I can't just publish it.
Yeah, no, this is not going out at all. There is
Okay,
one
that's
other
fine then.
participant who will see it. That's Joel Sharva, who's our advisor, who's working on the NIST grant, who couldn't make
Yeah.
it today. He was invited. But for sure, we'll definitely continue collaboration, Doctor. You know, and you know, this is very, very significant and huge intersection there with Dr. Naduzzi.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Yeah, I just asked because if it was going out, there's a different, like I just have to put a couple of things on the bottom of my slides and then we can. All right. Thank you.
everyone.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.